It seems like I get invited to give more of these talks where you just sort of wave your arms a lot and talk about big, broad things that other people can come along and actually talk about what they know. But John actually assigned me a topic for this. He didn't want me to talk about what I wanted to talk about. He wanted me to talk about what he wanted me to talk about. And it reminds me of an old friend we had, Terry Bidwell, still have. But when Terry was working, Terry used to tell me they can ask me to talk about whatever they want, but I'm still going to talk about whatever I want. And but it works out that John picked a pretty good topic, so I thought about it a lot. He basically wants me to talk about what if we didn't have fire, and I assume he means prescribed fire, because it's really impossible to outlaw wildfire. We've tried, but we've not done a very good job. And I assume that I can talk about that and try to be sort of a look to the future, but there are a few things that I'm pretty certain of. The first one is that if we outlaw fire, John Weir's going to jail. And I'm pretty sure that's true, and there may be a lot of you that join him, and some of us would have liked to have put him in there a long time ago. Okay, so the first point, and I thought about concluding there and just saying thank you, but since I'm actually supposed to talk about more, I thought about that a lot, and I thought, well, actually, you don't have to do a whole lot of future telling to look at what would happen if we outlaw fire, because essentially we have outlawed fire to a large degree for the past 150 years, except for in a few locations that are important locations. But so all you really have to do to tell the future is just look at the recent past. And so that makes my job a little bit easier. I could put away the crystal ball and actually think about that. And, you know, this is sort of a bubble. It's kind of fun to talk here. It's my bubble, people who like fire. So I don't have to convince you that fire is important. We all know that fire on these landscapes, most of North America is considered fire-dependent ecosystems. Some have real frequent fires and at different intensities, and some have very infrequent fires. But I just put this up to sort of set the stage. This is Rich Guyette's work that suggests how frequent fires would be in North America. And notice Texas and Oklahoma, it's 2 to 4 years, most of it. So in that case, I think most people here appreciate the fact that fire was a part of these systems, but we can see in a second. And I guess I'll point out, this is a group of well-intended professionals that have put together a map that tries to illustrate where prescribed fire can be a useful management tool. And the two darkest colors there represent 60 to 100% of a county that could be used, where prescribed fire could be useful. So fires were important, and fires can be useful. And you can disagree with one county in this map, but in general, the picture's probably fairly accurate. Now we can switch and look at actually where fires happen, and this even includes wildfires. And the red color is more fire, and the yellow is less. And so notice that largely, this is a landscape where we've eliminated fire. And in fact, if you look at the whole region and you look for fire signatures in broad scale data, it's really hard to find indications that fire is having a really positive impact. We all know it does locally, but when you look across the entire region, it's really difficult. And certainly you can focus in on specific areas, like one of the red areas in the previous map. This is the Flint Hills of Kansas with county of Oklahoma in it, showing just 1 year's fires that occurred. And so this is mostly prescribed fire, And so we know there are some areas that are conducting lots of fires, and we know individuals that are, but across the entire region, you get a much different picture. So one of the things we can do is sort of contrast these two and talk about why that's the case, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second, but some of you can talk more about that than I can. So if I really talk about what will happen when John goes to jail and we outlaw fire, prescribe fire, the first thing that comes to mind is the increase in woody plants. And we've all seen that, and that's one of the reasons that I sort of highlighted the idea that fire across the region is not a dominant thing that's happening as much as it should have been historically or could be. We've all seen the increase in woody plants, and all you have to do is drive around a little bit and you can see more and more of it. But I'm going to take a second. Well, okay, got ahead of myself. So when you look at the Great Plains, most of the Great Plains, this is a recent paper by a postdoc, Reinhard Schultz, where he did work, or he's working for me and along with Steve Archer at Texas A&M, or at University of Arizona. And we looked at the potential to have woody plant cover or across the Great Plains as you change rainfall. And I put the inches back on here because I'm just like you, sort of metrically challenged. But basically everything east of 25 inches has really the potential of having really high woody cover. And as you go west from there, there's even potential, but it declines. And Drac can point out that this graph is sort of based on what occurs now, and in reality it might be that that curve actually doesn't decline as rapidly as the data suggest. But nonetheless, much of the Great Plains, most people that fly over think it's all prairie, but in reality there's a lot of woodlands in the area, and much of that's due to fire. And we've all seen examples like this. This is from Sonora, Texas, showing sort of a state in transition model. So traditionally in range management, we managed grass. And so we worried about whether grazing was causing tall grass or short grass and increasing or decreasing productivity and how to manage that. All the while we were doing that, we moved from the left to the right. And one day I was out there with Brian Hayes collecting data, and we realized, hey, wait a minute, there's no grass left. It had basically become a woodland. So essentially you've got grass management, but then separate to that, at least that's the way it used to be viewed, we had this increase in trees where eventually we didn't have any grass left. There's examples from all over the world that are similar to this. Increase in woody plants is a dominant theme. So when we talk about increase in woody plants, what does that do? And I'm going to take a little side trip here and focus on woody plants. So as woody plants increase, what happens? First of all, one thing of interest to landowners is you get a decline in livestock production. And this is data from the Sonora Experiment Station showing an 8-fold decrease in livestock production. Now there's a lot in this graph. It's 100 years. And so I'm a range guy. So I might point out, well, first part of this, animal science was in charge of this property, and they don't know what they're doing, and they overgrazed it, and so that caused a big decline. And I would never say that, but some might say that. But then the experts in range took over in 1948 and stabilized for a little while, decreased the carrying capacity, or decreased the stocking rate, and then we saw a continued decline. And so what the primary driver of that, there's a lot of things that went into that, but the big thing is that we went from a grassland to essentially a woodland in that time period. And so we had an 8-fold, even if you just said it was 3-fold. This has led many of us working on a current proposal to argue that the greatest threat to livestock production in the southern Great Plains is the increase in trees. And I look forward to the day that when I see a ranchers driving around with the standard feed bin, ropes, and such, they'll also all have drip torches in the back of their pickups. Just for another example, in Stillwater, this is 2 pastures. The pasture 2's declining in livestock production. Adam Gorley knows this all too well. Pasture 2 essentially got down to where there was 1 animal for 80 acres. And pasture 1 stayed much higher. This is the economics, and that's because there were lots of fires in that pasture. They had different starting points, but the big change over time was fire versus no fire. So livestock production declines as woody plants decline, and that's been happening for the last 120 years, depending on where you are. If you don't like livestock production, maybe you like endangered species, we can talk about that briefly. Poster child for trees and being listed, although it's been delisted recently, is lesser prairie chicken. If you look at its historical distribution, lots of people point out that cultivation of grasslands led to their decline, which is very much true in the northern part. But I point out that most of the southern part has had an encroachment of woody plants. I mean, this species occurred almost all the way down to Mexico. And if you've spent much time in southwest Texas, there's not a whole lot of prairie left down there. So I argue that the majority of their habitat was actually lost through the encroachment of woody plants. And in fact, I recently published this paper. As you move from an intact grassland on the left to a fragmented landscape on the right, you get an increase in cropland and trees and a decrease in prairie. And the potential to manage prairie chickens on a ranch goes down as you go from left to right. So if you spend all your time thinking about how to manage the grass for chickens, but you're on the right side of that graph, you're sort of wasting your time. Really, you need to spend a lot of time thinking about how to get back to the further on the left side and limit the amount of fragmentation. Okay, so if you don't like endangered species, maybe you like other wildlife. Just a quick example, grassland birds. There's a reason they're called grassland birds, and that's because they don't like cedar trees, and it's pretty common. And these are declining rapidly, and they decline rapidly when you have an increase in trees. And some of these are even economically important. And in fact, in the eastern part of Oklahoma, about the best thing you can do to manage for bobwhite quail is to kill trees. And that is a dominant limiting factor to the east. The encroachment to the west and limiting that is also an issue. Okay, so if you don't like livestock or wildlife, maybe you like water and you want to talk about that. And water is a controversial issue. In Texas, there have been people that sort of promoted that you could make the rivers flow with fresh spring water in San Antonio if you just kill some trees in the Edwards Plateau. And that's been debated a lot. And there's some data that certainly suggests that that's been oversold. There are some data that also suggest that that could happen in local situations. But there is little debate, and in fact I use an example here from Chris Zhao at Oklahoma State University, that the encroachment of a grassland does greatly affect the water cycle. And what this graph shows is the amount of soil water in a system that has grass only or grass plus encroached juniper. And basically what it shows is when junipers encroach, you have less water available throughout the year, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that it keeps carrying out photosynthesis year round. If you don't like all of those things, maybe you like some wildfire danger, and this dates back to Henry Wright studying the volatile fuels in woody plants. More convincing is to watch the news during fire season, and the news misses a lot of things, but one thing they have learned, largely from John probably, is that cedar fires get hot, and they are really scary, and they create a lot of danger. That doesn't mean grass fires can't also be hot, but certainly cedar fires get hotter. Okay, so then in terms of woody plants, what else can I add to that? Since maybe we're not interested in ecology, maybe you're interested in diseases. The recent couple of studies have focused on, first of all, pollen and asthma rates. Estelle Levitin from Tulsa has been studying pollen, and specifically cedar pollen, and from ash juniper in Texas and eastern red cedar, and basically demonstrated that a rapid increase in pollen rates that's associated with an increase in even like childhood asthma rates across, in fact, they even have reported ash juniper from central Texas up into Chicago. So that certainly has health impacts. A recent set of efforts focused on vectors for human diseases and diseases in pets, mainly through ticks and mosquitoes, have expanded out into the west along with the encroachment of woody plants. So just leave you with that, suggesting that the increase in woody plants have changed most aspects of our landscape over the past 100 years or so, and will become more so as we move into the future. Okay, so after woody plants, the other report from outlawing fire might be the increase in wildfire, and Steve showed some great data from that, where those two seem to trade off. It's complex, though. It leads to a couple of questions. First of all, are wildfires increasing? Have they increased since we started suppressing fires and as the fuels have changed? And if we restored prescribed fire, could we limit the amount and extreme nature of wildfires? And there's lots of kinds of data out there, but I prefer to just look at Drac's pretty face here and quote Drac, and Drac will be up here later. But I really just wanted to put Drac's picture up there and watch him squirm a little bit. But basically, Drac has published a paper with his with a graduate student, Victoria Donovan, that has highlighted the increase in the Great Plains of extreme fires that have been occurring. And that's proof enough to me, but I figured I'd look into it a little bit more. If you look across the U.S., wildfires have not increased. It's a flat line. So basically, you might think, well, this suggests that Drac's wrong. And that's probably true, but I don't think he's wrong about that statement. So that suggests one thing, but you can look at numbers of acres burned, and it's actually gone up substantially. So we can look at that and start to understand. But so basically what we have is an increase in large fires. And most people have associated that with a longer fire season and climate change, but in reality, it could also be due to altered fuel loads from suppression of fire. And there's actually a survey paper that asks, can fires control fuel, limit fuel, and actually limit wildfires? And they had a hard time actually identifying that relationship. They did recognize that this is ragweed pollen actually, that they often do limit fires, but it's local and it's very short-lived. And I'll just highlight some of Heath Starnes. He's here. I should get him to come up here because he can probably talk. And Heath did a study from Texas to northern Oklahoma on 4 sites and found that, are looking at, can we manage fuel and manage wildlife, specifically prairie chickens. And Heath found that when you look at the fuel that accumulates following a fire, if you don't graze it, it accumulates very quickly. And so essentially, within less than a year, you have enough fuel to carry a very extreme fire. And in fact, we took this data. So this data shows ungrazed grasslands and then where we have fire and grazing interacting. So the fire can be selectively grazed by the herbivore. So patch burn, pyrrhic herbivory. This example shows that not only do you have to burn, but it matters how you follow up that fire. And in fact, when you run it through behave, those level lines there indicate different kinds of fire management that you would have to do to control a fire under fairly extreme conditions when you run this through behave. And it shows that essentially you get about 3 to 6 months of fire control when you burn and don't graze. You actually have to have this pyrrhic herbivory, which can stretch it out to 2 to 3 years when you have focused grazing occurring on the recently burned areas. So it's something I always try and talk about when people want to know if I burn more, am I going to have less fires? In reality, if you burn more, you might have more grass, which might actually lead to more fires or certainly better fuel conditions to carry a fire, but it may not be as severe of a fire when it happens. We also took that kind of data that Heath collected and put it into Farsight, where you can model like landscapes, and this is heterogeneous fuel loads based on the time since fire. So what happens if you spread these out across the landscape and then randomly drop fires on top of that? And you can see that you get different patterns of fire, and then you can change the size of the patch and change the heterogeneity of the fuel load, and you start to see that the fires completely change shape and you get different perimeter levels. And then we even did field studies where we modified the fuel load, keeping the fuel load constant, we modified the pattern. And what we saw was exactly what was reported in that previous paper, that you can lower the rate of spread by creating a more heterogeneous fuel base. So that suggests if you can use fire to create a patchwork condition, you can certainly lower the rate of spread, which would help in fighting wildfires at a minimum. So I mentioned trees affecting biodiversity, if you will, or wildlife. The fire mosaic, even within a grassland, is important as well. And I'm not suggesting that every species in every area needs everything burned every year. In fact, I'm suggesting quite the opposite. That basically what you need is a mosaic where it includes burned areas and unburned areas. And this is what's critical for biodiversity. This is a picture from the Tallgrass Prairie Preserve where you have a burn patch within an area that's largely, it's been a while since it's been burned, within a larger area that's maybe more of it's burned. So you sort of have patches within patches within patches. And many of us have argued this is what makes biodiversity of southern Great Plains rangelands, is this mosaic. And an example of that, this is published in Conservation Biology, looking at what grassland birds require. Obviously they require grasslands, but what about time since fire? And the argument is if you want a full suite of grassland birds, you have to have an area that's recently burned and grazed, all the way to an area that hasn't been burned or grazed for several years. We've done this with invertebrates, small mammals, etc. Shelley Wiggum's here, she's worked on this with pollinators, and it sort of repeats itself over and over again. And it's not just in the Great Plains, just to sort of point this out. They're using this as a model even in Africa, in the Great Basin. This is Rick Miller's work. The fire is no longer 3 years apart. This is a 100-year fire return interval. But some species benefit from recently burned areas while others are in unburned areas. So in order to have all of these, you have to have all of these conditions across the landscape. And even for some individual species, this is greater prairie chickens. And if you look, the same gradient on the bottom with months since fire and grazing actually. And we have lecking grounds where chickens do their dance that Bob Hamilton will demonstrate now. We have nesting required in closed or a thick grassland that has lots of cover that hasn't been burned or grazed recently. And then brood rearing is in between. And if these move around the landscape, then what we found is that chickens actually move around the landscape. So we used to think these leks were all permanently located, but in reality, they can shift. And this was going to be a video where I demonstrated, so we called the fire grazing interaction pyrrhic herbivory, and then recently we published a paper about pyrrhic carnivory, which is where hawks selectively forage on recently burned areas. And I had this cool video, but I'm not going to show it, that has Mississippi kites just coming in droves of, in response to a recent fire. And there's quite a few species that do this. So to suggest it's not just the fire mosaic, but having fires on the land now benefits some species. And this is such a commonly described phenomena that there's even reports that raptors may spread fire. Now, I got this off the internet, so I'm sure it's true. And actually, this is the way the internet works. I really don't care if it's true or not because I want it to be true. So I'm going to spread it around and make it true. But they reported seeing raptors picking up burning branches and moving them to areas that weren't. So even if it isn't true, it's still cool. Recently burned areas are highly preferred by migrating shorebirds, and I'll just leave it at that instead of, basically shorebirds need recently burned areas. And then the last point on biodiversity, mountain plovers are thought to be tied to prairie dog towns. And we've recently found that they're largely attracted to recently burned areas. And I don't know if anybody can see a mountain plover chick in that picture. The lowest prickly pear pad there is actually a mountain plover chick. So I don't know what that means for sure, but it certainly suggests that maybe a mountain plover chick has seen a prickly pear pad that's been burned before, because they certainly look identical. The main point is that these fire-dependent systems, at least from a biodiversity standpoint, are highly dependent upon this mosaic that includes burned areas and unburned areas. Since we have woody plant encroachment, that probably needs to shift around a little bit so that you still maintain large grassland landscapes. So that's all true, but in reality, there are alternatives to fire. And so I thought I would just quickly hit on those. And like everything else, they have their benefits and negatives associated with each one of these, but we've tried using a lot of herbicides instead of fire for, I don't know, 70 years or so. And they work on some species, not so much on cedar, but they are expensive. We also have used heavy equipment. Goats will work, and they are economical, but you talk about cultural challenges of burning near San Antonio, go try and tell a rancher in the Flint Hills that he ought to have goats. And it's basically the same kind of sort of social point. But I will say, this is work done by Brian Coppage, and this is called transition matrix modeling. Basically, all you do, take aerial photographs through time, and you calculate the probability that a grassland will stay a grassland, and that's the little number underneath the grassland box, or will it transition to a woodland, or will a woodland transition to a grassland, so you can look at what's changing to what. And this work, what we were expecting based on our ecological models is that grasslands would transition to woodlands. That's what we've all seen, and that's what we've studied. But in reality, when you look at a landscape, we actually saw quite the opposite. We saw woodlands transitioning to grasslands more than vice versa. And we saw grasslands not transitioning much at all. So I will point out, that's because the ecological models are wrong, mainly because people live on these landscapes and they're actually doing stuff. So that's a shock to ecologists like me. It's not a shock to most people in the real world. But so all of a sudden you start to realize maybe it's the people that actually matter. They're actually doing things, and that we need to actually understand that. And so one of the things I've been working on recently is developing a socio-ecological perspective of this problem. And I know many of y'all have thought more about this. Oftentimes researchers are late to the scene. But the idea is that these are heavily managed landscapes, so to talk about the ecology without talking about the people that manage it is a little bit ridiculous. I've mostly worked in the black box, or the green box. Reason that fire happens or doesn't happen is either in the top circle or the blue box. And trying to understand this more from a social standpoint, or at least a social and ecological standpoint, is really important. And one way to look at this, if you look at the matrix there on the left, across the top, it's asking ecologically, should this place be a grassland? And so the answer would be yes, all the way to the right, and less so as you move left. The vertical is the culture of the area suited and allowing practices to actually occur that would allow a grassland to exist. And in reality, the only way you're going to get a grassland is if it's in the 4 position there, where not only do you have the ecological conditions suitable for a grassland, but you also have the social conditions. And there we go back to the Flint Hills. I was in Wichita, at Wichita State University, and we were talking about future research in the Flint Hills, and we were asked what was the greatest risk to sustainability of the region. And I made the suggestion that it's actually entirely social. If the social environment changes in that region and you get new people moving in that are less accepting to the current fire culture, then basically you're going to have transitions to woodlands. And it doesn't have, we can do all the ecology in the world, and it's not really going to change things. So to summarize, John Weir's going to jail. Many of us are happy about that. Fish are happy. Yeah, fish are happy too, yeah. Although he's not that good at fishing. So The future looks a lot like the present, only more of it. Lots of woody plants, increased wildfires, some due to volatile fuels, some increased fire severity. Probably won't increase the number of fires, but just the amount of acres burned and how many people, how much news it makes. Biodiversity effects, we have woody plant encroachment and the importance of a fire mosaic, which are really two separate points. There are alternatives that would have to become more important if we're going to keep any resemblance. They are not equivalents, so they aren't really alternatives. They can do parts. They're just not the same thing, unless you can get a goat to carry a drip torch. And then I'll just conclude with one final point. I do think that sometimes we live in a bubble where we talk to each other and we forget that there's a lot of the world that might not agree with us. And I found this website when I was preparing this and noticed that little highlighted, the top sentence there is actually out of that website that basically prescribed fires are killing babies and old people and causing all kinds of terror. So I just left that up so John could have a reason why he might be going to jail. And I'm done, so thank you.